The year could be measured not in months, but in seasons. And in the 1700s, for those with little, winter was not simply a time of snow, and frost. It was an adversary, a test of endurance that weighed upon body and spirit alike. For the rich, the season was softened by roaring fires, servants fetching kindling, and thick wool cloaks lined with fur. The cold was an inconvenience, not a mortal threat. But for the poor, the vast majority of the population, it was different. Every gust of wind carried with it the sharp reminder that survival was fragile. That warmth was not a guarantee, but a prize earned through struggle and suffering. The homes of the poor in villages scattered across Europe and in the small settlements of colonial America. Homes of the poor were humble to the point of desperation. Imagine a cottage no larger than a single modern room. Walls built from wattle and daba, simple weaving of branches covered in mud, straw, and clay. These walls cracked with the change of seasons, shrinking in the cold, letting icy air whistle through. Roofs sagged under the weight of snow, thatch turning brittle and breaking apart. Inside, the main room was everything: kitchen, bedroom, gathering place. A small hearth sat at its heart, but often there was little wood to burn. Wealthy estates controlled the forests, and laws forbade commoners from taking timber. So poor families scavenged. They gathered twigs, fallen branches, roots torn from frozen soil, even dung hardened in the frost. These scraps of fuel smoked heavily, leaving the room filled with soot, eyes watering, lungs aching. Yet without them there was nothing. The floor was dirt, damp, and uneven. Straw was scattered to soften it, but in the cold months that straw froze hard, offering no comfort. When frost came, it crept inside, painting the edges of the walls with delicate, cruel crystals. Children sometimes woke with their blankets stiff from ice, their breath hanging in pale clouds above their faces, fighting the cold indoors. Even within these walls, warmth was scarce. To fight the chill, families relied on each other. Beds, when they had them, were shared. Mothers, fathers, and children pressed tightly together beneath patchwork quilts sewn from old cloth, rags, and anything that could hold warmth. When blankets were not enough, they stuffed sacks with straw, leaves, or moss, laying them over their bodies. It was common for people to sleep in their day clothes, never changing, for there were no spare garments. Coats doubled as blankets, shoes were tucked under covers to keep them from freezing stiff, and children were tucked beneath their parents' arms like precious bundles of warmth. Even livestock sometimes joined the household indoors. Goats, chickens, and even pigs were brought inside at night, not only to keep them alive through the cold, but also to share their body heat with the family. The smell was strong, but life demanded compromise. The warmth of a living creature meant survival, the endless search for fuel. Wood, always wood, every day began and ended with the need for it. Boys and girls were sent out to scour the frozen countryside, fingers raw and red, searching for twigs along the road or scraps left by those wealthier than themselves. Entire days could be spent just to gather enough for a single night's fire. When wood could not be found, families turned to peat if they lived near bogs, cutting and drying the heavy blocks of earth to burn. Others burned bundles of straw, but straw vanished quickly in the flames, leaving only smoke and ash. Dung fires, too, were common, collected from cattle, dried in the sun during summer, and stored for winter use. The smell clung to hair and clothes, but it was fuel, and fuel was life. Winter's weight on the body, the cold did more than bite the skin. It seeped into bones, stiffening joints, slowing breath. Children coughed in the night, their chests rattling from damp air and smoke. The elderly grew weaker, their bodies unable to generate the warmth needed to endure. Frostbite was not uncommon. Fingers and toes turned black and numb. For some, the cold itself became the cause of death. Yet, for all its brutality, winter was endured. People adapted, adjusted, found ways to resist. The poor had no choice but to learn how to survive with little. They layered scraps of clothing, mended worn shoes with rope or cloth, patched roofs with mud and straw. They learned to huddle close, to share every scrap of warmth, and still, outside their fragile shelters, winter roared. The wind screamed over the fields, snow piled against doors, and the night stretched long and merciless. For the poor in the 1700s, every winter was not just a season, it was a battle. And each morning they woke alive, they had one, if only for another day. Winter was not only the season of cold, it was the season of hunger. For the poor, the two were inseparable companions, gnawing at the body and spirit alike. If the frost could not kill, outright hunger often finished the work. The year's harvest was a fragile promise. Crops gathered in autumn had to last through the long months until spring's planting. Grain was stored in sacks, potatoes and root vegetables buried in cellars, meat, salted beans, and peas dried. But for poor families, the stores were never enough. Wealthy landlords took their share first, leaving tenants with only what remained. A bad harvest meant disaster. A failed harvest meant famine. The empty larders, by December, the first signs of scarcity showed. The bread grew thinner, stretched with fillers, barley, rye, oats, or whatever scraps could be ground to dust. Flour was mixed with bran, chestnut meal, or even ground acorns. The bread that resulted was dark, heavy, and bitter. But it filled the stomach, and filling the stomach mattered more than taste. Salted meat, if it existed at all in poor homes, was rationed carefully. A family might save a single ham through the whole winter, slicing it paper-thin, adding it to stews so that the flavor spread without the meat disappearing too quickly. The broth became more valuable than the flesh. Bones were boiled again and again until they crumbled, every trace of nourishment pulled from them. Cellars held potatoes, turnips, and cabbages, though many rotted in the damp or froze in the ground before they could be dug. Families often found themselves scraping away mold, cutting off the soft rot, salvaging what little could still be eaten. Nothing was wasted. Even peelings, stalks, and skins were boiled into thin soup. By January, the cupboards often lay bare. Hunger gnawed steadily then, an ache that never truly left, making the cold bite deeper. The desperate meals of winter-poor families became inventive with their meager supplies. Soups and stews were the foundation of winter survival. A pot sat over the fire, never fully emptied, into which anything available was added: bits of vegetable, scraps of bread, bones, herbs, gathered in the summer and dried. Each day the stew grew weaker, thinner, until it was little more than flavored water in some regions. Famine breads were made with bark peeled from trees, ground and mixed with flour. The bread was coarse, splintering in the mouth, hard to chew and barely nourishing. Yet it was food, and food meant life. Wild herbs and weeds, dried in summer, were ground into pastes and boiled into thin broths. In dire times, people ate nettles, thistles, and dock leaves, though they offered little beyond a bitter taste and a trickle of vitamins. Children gathered moss, lichen, and even grass, chewing them slowly just to quiet the pangs. Winter fasts and silent tables for many. Hunger became a kind of rhythm. Families learned to fast without calling it such. Meals were reduced from 3 a day to 2, then to 1, then sometimes none. Children went to bed with empty stomachs, clutching their bellies beneath the covers, their cries muffled so as not to disturb their exhausted parents. The table became a place of silence. Where once there was laughter or prayer, there was now quietly the sound of chewing, the scraping of spoons against wooden bowls, and the steady knowledge that the food was nearly gone. Begging, theft, and charity. When hunger grew too sharp, people turned outward. The poor begged at church doors, hoping for scraps offered by wealthier parishioners. Charity was a Christian duty, and some towns established almshouses or distributed loaves of bread on Sundays. But supplies were never enough for all who needed them. Some stole when no other choice remained. A loaf of bread, a chicken, a sack of grain, small thefts that could mean survival for a family, yet punishment if discovered. In England, harsh laws treated even petty thefts severely. Still, desperation outweighed fear. Hunger was a stronger master than law. Hunger's told the body weakened quickly under hunger's rule. Faces hollowed, eyes grew sunken, and limbs trembled with fatigue. Children's growth slowed. The elderly withered fast. Sickness spread more easily, for without food, the body had no strength to resist. Colds deepened into fevers, coughs turned into consumption, frostbite into infection. Yet hunger was also endured. Families shared when they could. Neighbors traded scraps. Villages worked together in lean times. There was resilience, born of necessity, and always there was the hope that spring would return, that the fields would thaw, that new seeds could be planted, and that next year, perhaps, the harvest might be enough. But for now, through January, February, and often into March, hunger remained a constant companion. The cold numbed the body, but hunger gnawed from within. Together, they made winter the most brutal of seasons for the poor of the 1700s. Winter's bite did not only gnaw at the stomach, it crept into the very bones, settling into the marrow with a cold that felt endless. For the poor, the question was simple yet cruel: how to endure the cold when you owned almost nothing. The rich wrapped themselves in wool cloaks, fur-lined coats, leather boots, and warm mittens. Their fires burned brightly, their beds layered with blankets of down and linen. But the poor had only what they could patch together, salvage, or inherit. Clothing was not fashion, it was survival. The life of a garment. Clothes were not easily bought. A single wool tunic or a coarse linen shirt might last a poor person a decade or more. Garments were patched again and again, sleeves restitched, holes covered with whatever scraps could be found. Mothers saved the tiniest bits of cloth, folding them carefully in baskets, knowing that one day those scraps would become patches on a child's knees or elbows. Perhaps it once belonged to a grandfather, then a father, then finally to the son. By the time it reached its last wearer, it was threadbare, the seams stiff with repeated mending, its wool more whole than fabric. Still, it was precious. Without it, the winter could be fatal. Children often wore clothes too large for them, hand-me-downs that hung off their small bodies. To make them fit, mothers tied them with bits of rope or stuffed the sleeves. The garments looked awkward, but they served their purpose to cover bare skin from the frost. Layers of survival. The poor did not dress for beauty. They dressed in layers, whatever layers they could assemble. Linen shirts were worn until they were nearly transparent. Over them came wool garments, sometimes stiff, sometimes itchy, but always warmer than nothing. If another shirt or coat could be found, it was added. When true garments ran out, rags were tied on as makeshift scarves and mittens. Old stockings became fingerless gloves. Strips of cloth were wound around heads to keep ears from freezing. Feet were bound in rags as well. 4 leather shoes were rare luxuries. Some stuffed their shoes with straw, moss, or scraps of fabric, creating crude insulation against the snow. Women often stuffed their skirts with straw or dried grass, creating extra padding against the cold. It rustled as they walked, but it held warmth better than thin fabric alone. Children sometimes did the same, laughing nervously at the strange sound, though their mothers only smiled wearily, grateful for anything that kept them alive. Sleeping in rags at night, the clothing was never fully removed. To undress in winter was to invite death. Families slept in their clothes, their stockings, their hats, sometimes even their shoes. The garments smelled of smoke from the fire, of sweat from labor, of damp from melted snow, but no one cared. Warmth was all that mattered. Blankets were few. Some households owned only one, shared by all. To make up for the lack, people piled straw on their beds, layering it beneath them for insulation and covering it with rags above. Old sacks became covers. Old cloaks became bedding. Sometimes families piled together in one bed, bodies pressed close, exchanging breath and warmth. Parents with children, siblings with siblings, skin against skin. When fabric was not enough, the harsh gift of wool was the fabric of survival. It held warmth even when damp, and though coarse and itchy against the skin, it was the most reliable defense against frost. Poor families longed for woolen garments. When sheep were sheared, most of the wool went to markets and wealthy buyers. But sometimes scraps could be claimed. Women spun coarse wool at home, knitting stockings or simple mittens. The yarn was rough, uneven, but it made the difference between frost-bitten fingers and survival. Some wore cloaks pieced together from different fabrics, half wool, half linen, patched so many times they looked more like quilts than garments. These cloaks carried stains of mud, soot from fires, and the marks of weather, but they were never discarded. A torn cloak still warmed. A dirty cloak still sheltered the cold that entered anyway. Even with all these efforts, the cold was never truly kept away. The wind found its way through seams, through holes, through threadbare cloth. Snow melted into shoes, soaking rags. Frost crept under collars, numbing the skin. Fingers cracked, lips split, ears grew red and raw. Frostbite was a silent enemy. It began with numbness, then blackened the tips of toes and fingers. The poor had no means to treat it. A lost finger was endured. A lost foot could mean death, for without it, work became impossible. And yet people carried on, limping, shivering, clinging to whatever warmth they could muster. Pride in rags, yet within this poverty there was also pride. A patched garment showed resilience, proof of a mother's careful work, proof of a family's endurance. Children sometimes laughed at their mismatched stockings or the way straw poked from their sleeves, but deep down they understood it was not foolishness, but ingenuity. For the poor of the 1700s, clothing was never about display. It was about defiance. Each patched sleeve, each layer of rags, each scrap of straw stuffed into a shoe was a quiet declaration: we will not let winter take us. The homes of the poor in the 1700s were not fortresses against winter. They were fragile shells, barely able to shield their occupants from the endless cold. For the wealthy, grand stone houses stood tall, with thick walls, polished floors, and roaring fires. But for peasants, day laborers, beggars, widows, and orphans, the reality was a simple hut, a cramped cottage, or even just a shed patched together with scraps of wood and clay. The cottage walls, say, poor family's cottage, was usually made of wattle and daba, frame of wood, woven with sticks, then plastered with clay and straw. In summer, it held together well enough, but in winter, the clay cracked, the straw loosened, and the icy winds slipped through the gaps. When the snow fell hard, the walls themselves seemed to groan under the weight, their thin structure struggling to hold. Some cottages were made of rough stone, but the stones were unpolished, their gaps stuffed with mud. When frost came, the mud crumbled, leaving holes. Through these holes, the cold whistled like a ghost, touching sleeping children's faces and making their teeth chatter in the night. Families often pasted rags, moss, or straw into cracks, desperately trying to stop the wind. Mothers pushed old garments into holes in the walls. Fathers smeared clay over gaps, their hands shaking from the cold. But no matter how carefully they worked, the frost always returned. Roofs that leaked snow, the roofs were little protection, too. Thatched roofs made of reeds or straw were common among the poor. They were light, inexpensive, and quick to build, but they were no match for a heavy snowfall. When snow settled on them, it slowly melted, dripping into the rooms below. Sometimes the roof itself sagged under the weight. Families lay awake, listening to the creaking above, fearing the collapse of their only shelter. When water dripped down, it landed on beds stuffed with straw, soaking the bedding until it grew heavy and damp. Dampness was a curse in winter. A wet blanket could freeze into stiffness, trapping more cold than warmth. Children cried at night as the water seeped in, their little hands clutching their parents' arms for comfort. The hearth, every poor home had a hearth. It was not grand, not carved of stone, but a simple fire pit, sometimes just a hollow in the floor lined with stones. Above it hung a blackened pot, suspended from a hook. The fire was meant to be the heart of the home, but often it smoldered weakly. For wood was scarce and fuel expensive, smoke often filled the room. Chimneys were rough and narrow, or sometimes there was no chimney at all, just a hole in the roof where the smoke was meant to escape. On still nights, the smoke lingered, stinging eyes, coating the walls in soot, and choking the air until children coughed in their sleep. Yet families clung to that fire. They sat as close as they dared, stretching hands toward its small warmth, turning damp shoes and rags to dry them. Mothers stirred thin broths in the pot, adding cabbage leaves, scraps of bone, or barley if they had it. The fire was not only warmth, it was survival. The cold inside, despite all efforts, the cold always found its way inside. Frost crept across the windows if the family was lucky enough to have windows at all. Often there was only an open shutter, or a hole covered with oiled cloth or paper. The frost turned the edges white, like lace, beautiful yet cruel. Sometimes, in the morning, a thin layer of ice formed inside the water bucket kept by the hearth. Children woke to see their breath fogging the air, their blankets stiff with frost. The cottage itself felt less like a home and more like a fragile cave, barely separating them from the frozen night. Families in one room. Most poor cottages had only one room. In that room, everything happened: cooking, sleeping, working, living. Parents and children all slept together, often in the same bed, pressed so close they could feel each other's hearts beat. Animals, too, sometimes shared the room. Chickens, goats, or even a cow might be brought inside during the harshest nights. Their bodies gave extra warmth, and though the smell was sharp and the space tight, survival was worth more than comfort. The room was filled with the sound of coughs, the creak of the roof in the wind, the faint crackle of the fire, and the slow breathing of bodies huddled together. Outside, the snow fell endlessly, but inside, families clung to each other, whispering prayers that the roof would hold, that the fire would not die, that morning would come. Drafts and desperation to fight drafts. People hung old sacks or bits of cloth across doorways. Doors were often just planks, sometimes a curtain of thick fabric. When the wind rattled them, families shivered. Children sometimes played a quiet game, guessing where the next draft would come from, feeling the icy air touch their cheeks like invisible fingers. The cold seeped into every corner. Even in sleep, people curled tight, knees pulled to their chests, arms wrapped around themselves. Dreams were not of luxury, but of warmth: a roaring fire, a heavy blanket, a meal eaten in comfort, a house that was not a home in truth. These cottages were not designed to keep winter at bay. They were cheap, simple, and temporary in spirit, though families lived in them for generations. Winter revealed their weakness. The poor did not live in homes. They lived in shells, barely holding against the season's fury, and yet they endured. They patched, repaired, stuffed, and prayed. Though their homes shuddered under snow and wind, they remained standing. And inside those fragile walls, families learned that the greatest warmth was not from fire or wool, but from each other. If the cold was the sharpest enemy of the poor, then hunger was its cruel companion. Winter in the 1700s was not simply a season of frost, it was the season when cupboards grew bare, fields lay frozen, and stomachs ached with a gnawing emptiness that no fire could chase away. For those with wealth, pantries were stocked with salted meats, barrels of grain, preserved fruits, and cellars lined with wine. But for the poor, winter often meant watching their food supply shrink day by day. wondering which meal would be the last before starvation began its slow, merciless work. Storing for the cold in autumn, poor families did their best to prepare. They dried beans, stored barley, salted small fish, or hung strips of meat if they were lucky enough to own an animal. Root vegetables like turnips, onions, and parsnips were dug from the earth and buried in pits, covered with straw and soil to keep them from freezing. But storage was a gamble. If the pit grew too damp, vegetables rotted. If snow melted into the cellar, grain molded. If rats found their way in, entire sacks of barley or oats could be lost in a single night. Each spoiled sack was a small tragedy, a sign that the winter would be harder than expected. Bread and brothta, staple food of the poor, was bread but not the soft white loaves of the wealthy. Their bread was dark, dense, and coarse, baked from rye, barley, or even oats, mixed with whatever fillers could be found. Sometimes straw, ground acorns, or powdered roots were added to stretch the flour further. The bread was heavy in the hand, hard on the teeth, but it filled the stomach. Alongside bread, broths simmered in iron pots. They were thin, often little more than hot water, flavored with cabbage leaves, bones, or barley grains. Meat was rare, reserved for feast days or stolen moments of fortune. Most of the time, the broth carried only the memory of meat, a bone boiled again and again until no flavor remained. Yet even the poorest broth carried warmth, and in winter, warmth was as valuable as nutrition. Hunger's shadow as winter deepened. Hunger grew. The loaves grew smaller, the broth thinner, the scraps fewer. Parents often ate less so their children might eat more. Mothers sometimes went without food for days, pretending their bellies were full while secretly praying that their children would not notice. Hunger made people restless at night. They lay awake, listening to the growl of their own stomachs. Children whimpered in their sleep, calling for food in their dreams. In some cottages, silence fell heavy in the evenings, not because there was nothing to say, but because speaking only reminded them of the emptiness they all shared. Desperate measures when the cupboards were empty. Families turned to desperate measures. They gathered nettles, wild herbs, or bark to grind into flour. Some stripped bark from trees, boiling it into a bitter paste. Others ate acorns, carefully leaching out their poison. Though the taste was harsh and the stomach resisted, in times of true famine, cats, dogs, and even rats became meals. It was whispered with shame, but it happened. Hunger stripped away pride, leaving only survival. Some stole from fields or barns, risking beatings or imprisonment. A loaf of bread could be worth a man's freedom. A chicken taken from a lord's coop might feed a family for days, but the punishment could be severe. Still, many took the risk, because the greater punishment was to watch their children starve. The hunger season, the most feared time, was late winter, when the food from autumn was gone and spring had not yet come. It was called the hungry season. Snow still lay on the fields. Animals had not yet fattened, and no fresh plants had begun to grow. This was when hunger cut deepest, when children grew thin and weak, and old people slipped quietly into death. Families prayed for early springs. They looked to the horizon each morning, hoping for signs of thaw, for the first shoots of green. But winters in the 1700s were often long and merciless. For some, spring never arrived. Sharing and solidarity at hunger was not born alone. In villages, neighbors sometimes shared what little they had. A loaf of bread was divided into slivers. A pot of broth was stretched to feed not one family, but 3. It was not enough to cure hunger, but it was enough to keep despair from devouring hope. Sometimes, traveling beggars knocked at doors, asking for scraps. Though poor themselves, families often gave what they could: a crust of bread, a ladle of broth, because they knew the hunger in another's eyes. In such gestures, the poor found strength not in abundance, but in compassion. Hunger as memory for the poor. Hunger was not just a sensation, it was a memory passed down through generations. Children who had known the gnawing emptiness of one winter would tell their children, warning them of the cruelty of the cold months. Old folk would shake their heads by the fire, recalling winters when entire families perished from starvation. Hunger was a shadow that never left, even in summer. When fields grew green and food was plentiful, the memory of winter's emptiness remained. Each bite of bread was savored with the knowledge that it might not be there tomorrow. The hunger of winter was not only about the absence of food, it was about the absence of comfort. The quiet fear of death that crept into every meal. Yet, somehow, the poor endured. They patched their loaves, thinned their broths, and found ways to live another day, even when the world seemed determined to let them starve. The cold of winter did not excuse the poor from labor. Hunger demanded work, rent demanded work, survival demanded work. While the wealthy retreated into their estates, sitting by roaring fires and sipping spiced wine, the poor stepped into the snow and wind, their bodies weary, their clothes thin, their hands raw. For the poor, winter was not a season of rest, it was a season of toil made harder by frost. To stop working meant to stop eating, and so, with shivering limbs and breath turning to mist, they worked. The fields at rest, the peasants' knoten, the countryside, fields lay frozen, hard as stone. No plowing could be done, no planting, no sowing. Yet peasants still labored. They mended tools, patched fences, and cut firewood for their landlords. Some were tasked with clearing snow from roads or carrying supplies across frozen ground. Woodcutting was common labor. Men trudged into the forest, axes slung across their shoulders, searching for trees to fell. The forest in winter was both friend and enemy. Its trees offered fuel, but the cold within it was merciless. Fingers stiffened on the axe handle, breath wheezed into the icy air, and sweat froze on brows as they swung steel into bark. Each log carried back was precious. Sometimes peasants sold wood to earn coins, though most of it went to their lords. Only scraps remained for their own hearths. Children sometimes followed, gathering twigs and fallen branches, their little bodies bundled in rags, their lips trembling blue. Labor for coin day. Laborers sought any work they could. Some shoveled snow, some carried water from frozen wells, their hands numbed by the icy buckets. Others dug trenches in frozen earth for landlords who demanded preparation for spring. Work was scarce, and pay was scarce too. A few found work in towns, hauling coal, sweeping streets, or working in cold, damp warehouses. But the competition was fierce. Men fought for even the smallest jobs, their pride abandoned before hunger's demand. Beggars, those too weak or Too unlucky to find labor wandered from door to door, their feet wrapped in rags, their hands stretched out in silent pleading. Some received a crust of bread, others a sharp word or a slammed door. Winter was cruelest to them. Without steady work, many never saw spring. The burden of women's workwoman, too, labored through the frost. They spun wool with stiff fingers, the fibers clinging to raw skin. They patched garments by candlelight, their needles slipping in the dim glow. Some walked to markets with baskets of eggs, vegetables, or milk, their skirts heavy with frost as they trudged through the snow. For many women, winter labor was not only about survival, but about keeping children alive. They rose before dawn, lit fires if fuel was left, fetched water, cooked thin meals, and worked all day with no pause. The cold gnawed at their bodies, but duty kept them moving. Children in the cold children were not spared. They were sent to gather sticks, chase after animals, or carry bundles of straw. Some walked to towns, their small hands red and cracked, offering to sweep floors or fetch water for a coin. Others tended animals, driving goats or sheep through snow to search for grazing. They shivered in thin coats, stamping their feet to keep blood moving, their eyes stinging from the icy wind. Childhood was not play in the winter. Was another form of labor, carried on small, fragile shoulders. The cold that followed work did not warm the poor, it wore them down. After hours of labor, sweat clung to their clothes, chilling their skin even more. They returned home with numb fingers, aching limbs, and frost-bitten toes. Inside, the fire was too small to truly warm them, and so they lay shivering, their muscles sore, their bellies still empty. Winter work was survival work. It did not bring riches. It barely brought enough to live. Yet it had to be done, for without it there would be no food, no rent, and no hope. Endurance, as labor and so labor in winter, was not only the swinging of axes, the sewing of wool, the gathering of sticks. It was endurance itself, to keep walking, to keep breathing, to keep rising each morning despite the gnaw of hunger and the bite of frost that was its own work. The poor carried this burden quietly, with no reward but survival, with no applause but the whisper of another day endured. The cold was unrelenting, but so were they. When the sun fell in the 1700s, winter deepened into its cruelest form. The poor dreaded the night. For darkness did not only mean sleep, meant colder air, weaker fires, and the long hours of shivering that stretched until dawn. For the wealthy, nights were lit with candles, fires fed with piles of wood, beds piled with soft down blankets. But for the poor, the night was a test of endurance, of togetherness, of willpower against the creeping frost that seemed determined to steal life from their lungs. The dying fire at dusk. Families gathered around the hearth, feeding the last pieces of wood into the flames. Each stick was placed carefully, as if it were gold. The fire was coaxed to last as long as possible, the embers pushed together, the sparks blown upon gently, lovingly. But wood was scarce, and by midnight the flames often dwindled to a faint red glow. The fire's last warmth filled the cottage with a fragile comfort. Children reached their hands out, holding on to the final breath of heat. Parents sighed, knowing that when the fire went out, the true cold would begin. Some families tried to bury the embers under ash, keeping them alive until morning. Others placed stones near the fire, carrying them to bed for a fleeting warmth beneath their blankets. But no trick could last the night. Eventually, the fire would die, and the darkness would claim the room. Beds of straw beds were not the feathered comfort of the rich. They were rough mattresses, stuffed with straw or reeds, sometimes covered with old cloth, sacks, or patched quilts. In winter, the straw grew damp and cold, the smell of earth rising with every movement. Families lay together, huddled close, children pressed between parents, bodies overlapping, a tangled heap of survival. The warmth of bodies was the only true blanket. Parents wrapped arms around children, brothers and sisters, pressed cheek to cheek. Even the smallest infant contributed, its tiny body adding to the fragile pool of warmth. Families learned to sleep in stillness, conserving heat. Moving as little as possible, some shared their beds with animals, chickens, goats, or even dogs because the warmth of an animal was worth more than the discomfort of sharing space. In the darkest nights, survival left no room for pride. The silence of snow outside. The night was silent. Snow muffled every sound, covering the earth in a blanket so thick it seemed the world itself was sleeping. The only noises were the occasional groan of a tree under ice, the distant howl of wolves, or the whistle of wind squeezing through cracks in the cottage walls. Inside, the silence was broken by coughs, by the shifting of straw, by the faint moans of children dreaming of food. Sometimes the cottage was so quiet that the drip of melting snow from the roof became the loudest sound in the room. The silence was heavy, pressing, as though winter itself was listening to every breath. Fear in the dark night brought fear to the fear of not waking, the fear that the fire would not spark again in the morning. Parents watched their children's faces, touching them in the dark, to feel if their cheeks were still warm. Old people often prayed before sleep, whispering that if they did not wake, they hoped spring would still come for the young. For some, death came quietly in the night. A baby whose tiny body could not endure the frost, an elder whose breath slowed and then stopped. Sometimes, in the morning, a body was found cold and still beside the living, a silent reminder of winter's cruelty. Dreams of warmth yet, even in such nights, the poor dreamed. Their dreams were filled with visions of warm throaring fires, endless bread, heavy blankets, the taste of rich stews. Children dreamed of summer fields, running barefoot through tall grass. Parents dreamed of long-forgotten feasts, their mouths watering even in sleep. Sometimes the dreams were cruel, for they ended at dawn when hunger and cold returned. Yet sometimes the dreams gave just enough comfort to carry a soul through the night. Dawn's first light. The first light of dawn was not golden, it was gray, pale, and weak. But it was salvation. Families stirred from their beds, their bodies stiff, their breath heavy with the night's cold. Children sat up, teeth chattering, and parents rushed to relight the fire with the last embers buried in ashdot. If the fire sparked, if smoke rose again, it was a victory, a small victory, but one that meant survival. Another night endured. Another chance to face the day. The nights of winter in the 1700s were not peaceful slumber. They were battles, fought under thin blankets, in damp straw beds, against the invisible enemy of frost. And yet, night after night, the poor endured, clinging to each other in the dark, waiting for the fragile hope of dawn. Winter was not only the season of cold, it was the season of sickness. The poor dreaded it, not just for the hunger and frost, but for the coughs that echoed through cottages, the fevers that burned through weak bodies, and the silent deaths that came when help was far away. The first cough fit often began with something small, a cough, rough and dry, a sniffle, ignored at first, a child's nose running in the cold, or an old man's hacking in the dark. But in a world without warmth, without medicine, without doctors, even the smallest cough could grow into a monster. The air in winter was damp, thick with smoke from dying fires, heavy with mold from wet walls. Breathing itself was a burden. Lungs struggled against the chill, and sickness spread quickly in the cramped cottages where families huddled together. No healers for the poor doctors existed, but not for the poor. Physicians demanded silver coins money a starving family did not have. Herbalists and wise women gave advice, sometimes offering teas of nettle, elderberry, or thyme. A mother might boil pine needles to make a bitter drink for her coughing child. A father might rub garlic on a wound, hoping it would heal. But remedies were weak, and superstition often replaced medicine. Some hung charms to ward off illness. Others prayed by candlelight, whispering for angels to protect their children. Still, fevers rose, coughs deepened, and sickness claimed its victims. The burning fever in the middle of winter. Fevers were the most feared. The body that had been shivering with cold would suddenly burn with heat. Sweat poured down pale faces, soaking straw beds, even as the icy air froze it to the skin. Children tossed and turned, crying out in delirium, their parents helpless beside them without medicine. Fever could last for days, leaving the strong weak and the weak lifeless. Families sat by the sick bed, feeding spoonfuls of broth if they had it, or just water if they did not. Sometimes the fever broke, leaving behind a survivor. Sometimes it did not. The winter plagues beyond coughs and fevers, other horrors lurked. Typhus, smallpox, and influenza often struck in waves, cutting through villages like invisible blades. In the poor quarters, where cottages stood close together and filth lay in the streets, disease spread faster than fire. Entire families could vanish in a single season. Neighbors whispered prayers over closed doors, too afraid to enter, too afraid to help. The poor did not have the choice to fleet travel, required money, food, and strength they did not possess. They stayed and they endured, while sickness took its share. The heaviest burden, mothers bore the heaviest pain. To watch a child grow weaker each day, to see tiny hands lose strength, to hear the cough that rattled like broken glass, this was a cruelty worse than hunger. Many mothers sat awake through the night, rocking fevered children, singing lullabies through tears, their voices trembling with both love and despair. Old people too often carried guilt. They whispered that they had lived long enough, that the younger should be spared. Some gave up their portion of food, their share of blankets, hoping it would buy another day of life for the children. When death came, death in winter was quiet. No loud mourning, no long ceremonies. When someone died, the family wept in silence, wrapping the body in cloth or straw, sometimes leaving it until the ground softened enough to dig a grave. In the hardest winters, frozen earth forced them to wait, keeping the body in a cold shed or under snow until the thaw. Yet even in grief, life had to go on. The fire had to be tended, the children fed, the animals checked. Sorrow was folded into the rhythm of survival. Small victories, still not every illness, ended in death. Some survived. A child's fever broke with the rising sun. A cough faded after weeks of struggle. Families clung to these victories, small as they were, as proof that winter could not steal everything. When someone rose from the bed, weak but alive, the whole family felt reborn. They thanked God, or luck, or the strength of the human body. In those moments, hope returned like a spark in the cold darkness. The weight of memory-ness left scars, not just on bodies, but on hearts. Survivors remembered the faces of those who did not wake. They remembered the silence of nights broken only by coughing. They remembered the prayers whispered into frozen air, and when spring finally came, with its first green shoots and warmer winds, the poor carried those memories like stones in their pockets heavy, but a reminder of what they had endured. The poor of the 1700s did not just fight hunger and cold in winter. They fought invisible enemies inside their own homes, fevers, coughs, plagues that struck with as much cruelty as frost. Yet through love, through stubbornness, through sheer will to live, many endured. In the 1700s, poverty often meant loneliness. Yet, in the deep heart of winter, when the cold pressed hardest and the nights seemed endless, people discovered that survival was not only about fire, food, and shelter. It was also about each other, sharing the little they had for the poor. Generosity was not born from abundance, but from desperation. Families who had a little more bread would break it in half, passing the smaller portion to a neighbor whose children were hungry. A widow with no wood might find a bundle of sticks quietly left at her door. A sick man might awaken to find a bowl of broth waiting beside him, gifted by a neighbor who had gone without supper themselves. It was not charity as we think of it today. It was survival woven through kindness. Everyone knew that next time they could be the ones in need. Nights in company, the cold was most unbearable in silence, so people sought each other's company. In villages, small gatherings formed in the evenings, not in grand halls, but in the dim corners of cottages. Families crowded together, bringing what little they had. A pot of soup might be stretched across 3 households. A single candle gave light to more than one family. They told stories, legends, prayers, jokes whispered to ease the fear. Children drifted to sleep on straw mats, while their parents spoke in hushed tones, planning how to survive the next storm. The fire burned brighter when more souls sat around it, and even the cold outside seemed weaker when faced with shared laughter. The gift of labor help was not always food or fuel, it was labor. A strong young man might chop wood for an elderly neighbor who could no longer swing an axe. Women worked together to mend clothes, patching torn garments with scraps from their own. When roofs leaked or doors broke, neighbors patched them with whatever they could find. So at least the wind would not bite so cruelly. Even in their own hunger, people gave time and muscle, knowing that survival for one meant survival for all. The warmth of faith churches often became centers of refuge. Though they could not offer endless food, they provided warmth, a place to gather, and above all, a reminder of hope. Candles burned during services, filling the air with light that comforted weary souls. priests and ministers spoke of endurance, of heaven, of eternal reward for earthly suffering. For many, faith itself was a kind of fire. Prayers, whispered in unison, carried people through the longest nights. The children's bondchildren, too, learned early that survival was shared. They walked together in groups to gather wood, to fetch water from frozen wells, to search for berries or roots beneath snow. Their laughter, though faint, broke through the heaviness of winter. Sometimes they invented games simply to forget hunger, chasing one another in the snow, carving shapes in frost, or singing simple rhymes while their breath made clouds in the air. To see children laugh in the midst of hardship reminded adults why they endured. When strangers became family, winters blurred the lines between blood and kinship. Strangers became family when doors opened in the night to welcome those in need. A traveler caught in a blizzard might be taken in, given a corner near the fire and a piece of bread. Tomorrow, that traveler might save another. Hospitality, though costly, was sacred. To refuse a freezing soul at the door was to invite death upon one's own. And so, in small acts of shelter, humanity was preserved. Lessons from the cold what winter taught the poor was not only how to survive it, taught them the value of togetherness. Alone, a single family might perish, but together they could stretch food longer, keep fires burning brighter, and keep spirits alive when despair knocked hardest. It was this strength of community, fragile, imperfect, yet powerful, that carried villages through the brutal cold, the glow of hope. And so, amid frost, hunger, and endless nights, something remarkable endured. Hope, not the hope of riches or comfort, but the hope of simply making it to spring. Every shared loaf, every mended cloak, every whispered story was a thread in the fabric of survival. In the darkness, the poor became light for one another. Winter felt eternal in the 1700s. Weeks of frozen nights, empty stomachs, and endless struggle carved themselves deep into the bones of the poor. Yet, no matter how cruel the cold, spring always returned. It crept in slowly, quietly at first, like a shy guest knocking on the door of suffering. The first signs of change, the earliest sign, was not warmth, but sound. Where silence and howling winds had ruled for months, a bird's song pierced the stillness. A small note, carried on the crisp air, gave weary souls the first reminder that the earth had not abandoned them. Snow began to soften, dripping into muddy rivulets that traced paths down village lanes. Children who had spent weeks huddled indoors stepped out barefoot into damp soil, laughing as the sun touched their faces for the first time in months. The ground, once a slab of frozen death, slowly opened its hands to green shoots. The sight of grass poking through melting snow was enough to make people weep. The thaw of life as rivers unfroze. Fish could be caught again. Streams gurgled where ice had silenced them. Water, once gathered by breaking ice with numb hands, now flowed freely. With the thaw came food. Nettles, bitter but nourishing, grew in patches. Wild garlic and dandelion greens offered freshness that had been missing for too long. The earth's small gifts, though humble, tasted sweeter than any feast. Cattle and sheep that had survived the winter grew stronger in the fields. Chickens laid eggs again, and their fragile shells represented not just nourishment but a future. The end of darkness days grew longer. The oppressive blackness that had swallowed winter nights receded, replaced by evenings where families could sit outside their huts and breathe without shivering. Fires were still lit, but no longer desperately fed with every scrap of wood. Smoke curled into the air with a gentler rhythm, no longer a desperate shield against frost. Inside cottages, windows were opened, if only to let sickness out. Stale winter air, heavy with coughs and dampness, gave way to breezes carrying the scent of earth and blossoms. Remembering the lost spring brought joy, but it also brought mourning. As families stepped into the sunlight, they remembered those who had not survived. Graves freshly dug in thawed soil marked the cost of winter's rain. Empty chairs, silent corners, and the absence of familiar voices were wounds as sharp as hunger. Communities grieved together, offering prayers, songs, or quiet moments of remembrance. For the poor, loss was familiar, yet each death left a scar that never quite healed. Lessons carried forward, winter taught them harsh lessons. How to share when there was nothing to give, how to survive with almost nothing, and how to endure loss without breaking. But it also taught them about resilience, the strength hidden in human hearts when tested by nature's cruelest. Seasoned children learned the value of fire, food, and kindness. They carried those lessons into adulthood, ensuring that the memory of hard winters shaped the generations to come. Hope for tomorrow, when spring's warmth finally settled in. Poor families celebrated not with feasts of gold and silver, but with gratitude. A pot of fresh herbs, a loaf of bread no longer made with sawdust or husks, a bed aired out in the sun, these were treasures beyond price. The laughter of children, chasing one another through green fields, was proof that life, despite everything, had endured. And, though they knew winter would return, they also knew this truth: they had faced its cruelty once more, and they had survived. The eternal cycle for the poor of the 1700s. Life was a cycle of struggle and endurance. Every winter was a battle, every spring a victory, and in those victories, no matter how small, they found meaning. Survival itself became their triumph. So when the sun rose higher in the sky and warmth spread across the land, the poor breathed deeply, lifting their faces to the light. Their scars remained, their losses remained, but so did their courage. The brutal ways they survived the cold had forged them into something unbreakable, proof of the quiet, stubborn strength of the human spirit.